Noswaith dda iawn i chi gyd, croeso cynnes a diolch am ymuno gyda ni hyn o webinar cyswllt ffermio a all clefydau rhewfryn fod yn rhwystro perfformiad eich diadell. Good evening, a warm welcome to you all and thank you very much for joining us for tonight's Farming Connect webinar. Could iceberg diseases be hindering your flock performance? Fy enw yw Menna Williams a fi fydd yn cadeirio'r webinar yma heno. My name's Menna and I'll be chairing the webinar this evening, so hopefully everything will run smoothly. You're welcome to ask any questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get through all of them by the end of the webinar. You're welcome to ask them as long as we go along during the evening, and we want to make the webinars interactive and get the most out of it for your interest. So if you've got any questions or want us to expand on any points, please just drop us a question and we'll get them answered. So tonight's webinar, as I mentioned, is on the topic of iceberg diseases in sheep, and presenting we have Philippa Page and Fiona Lover from Flock Health. Philippa has been working with Farming Connect discussion group members to gather physical performance data and undertaking screening for MV, Yoni, CLA, fluke, etc. She'll go through all these different diseases tonight. And also during the webinar, we're very fortunate to be joined by two of the farmers that were part of this work, and they will share their, their point of view and their experience of this kind of journey with iceberg diseases. So without further ado, if you're happy, Philippa, to share your screen. And then once you're happy, there we are. So we'll go for it. So you're happy, Philippa? Are you, everything's okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Philippa. So over to you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this evening, and welcome to this webinar. So hopefully, as Menna said, we want this to be we want to help you. We want to make sure we answer some questions if we can, that you've got them. So please do put them in the chat and we'll try and do that as we go through. So, oops, first bit of tech to get, there we go. Right, plan for today. So I think we'll just cover what are the iceberg diseases and help you think about whether you may have them. I don't want to scare you, and it's not to be scared of. So we are going to talk around this and help you think about whether you need to investigate this, and whether you have got a problem, what might be a problem, and some indications on what you can do about it, how you can prevent it. And then we'll also cover some of the findings that I've done in one of the projects that I've run through Farming Connect with my discussion groups that I have across Wales, which was the Thin Ewe and Flock Efficiency project. So firstly, it's in the title, are iceberg diseases an issue? What are iceberg diseases? And apart from sounding very scary when vets start to talk about these, because we can get very scientific, because there is lots of science behind what iceberg diseases are, we need to break this down and make it very simple for you, and simple for us as well. And firstly, if we think about how they impact in the flock, and almost all of them show very similar signs. They limit production, and mainly this is because they impact on body condition score of the ewes in the flock. So we get more thin animals than we expect and that we would like. Typically, the infection will occur in a younger animal, not always, but typically younger animals can pick up the infection, but we don't see that clinical disease until a lot later as those animals get older. So there's a long incubation period between when they become infected and when we start to see that clinical disease. And for that reason, they can do quite a lot of damage in that time, in how they impact the flock and almost hide from us when we're trying to find them. the more we learn about these diseases, the more we are starting to understand that time of incubation, and it can vary. So we are still learning as well about these diseases, but typically they have a very long incubation. As I said, they cause thin ewes. That's what we tend to hear from you as vets, that you're getting more thin ewes than you should, and also more dead ewes. And they are mainly a combination of viruses and bacteria that are infectious. So they spread from sheep to sheep, horizontally, as we would call it, or they can spread down from the mother to the offspring, and we would call that vertical transmission. Either way, they're infectious, and we can keep them in a flock by breeding them and maintaining them in a flock unknown to us. And we can buy them in as well. So we actually get a bit extra for our money when we buy sheep. Not that we want that, but we actually buy them in. And many flocks can determine when that occurred with some of these diseases. And you might be thinking now, okay, this could be interesting. You know, I remember a flock or a group of sheep that I bought and they brought with them problems. What might that be? So just before we go down the track of talking about these diseases, because there's quite a lot of information that I don't always think is that helpful, I think it's more helpful to think of your own flocks as you've got them there, as you sat on your farms, and think, right, what do we mean by thin, firstly, and why might they be thin? Is it always going to be an iceberg disease? And not necessarily, which we'll cover. So know you really, whatever breed, and I know there's breed variations, but a ewe that's less than 1 to 1.5 in body condition score has very, very little, if any, subcutaneous fat. So it has no reserves. And so we would class that pathologically as emaciated. So a thin sheep is something that's body condition score 1 to 1.5 or less. So whatever breed we've got, hill breeds I know are a lot lean, can feel a lot leaner, but all of those breeds need to have reserves. So when you feel the sheep, you need to be able to move your hand, you need to be able to feel the fat reserves underneath that skin and think, right, she's got something to be able to work with if she needs to. The leanest time that we find ewes typically to be is around weaning. So we can understand that is when they're likely to be most lean. Anywhere from sort of peak lactation, I suppose, just after. So from around 6 weeks after lambing up until weaning time, that's when those ewes get to their leanest. And I suppose minimum targets, I've just put a few up there. Really, for lowland, we don't want them to be dropping below 2.5, upland below 2, and hills below 1.75, typically. But again, you'll have your own sort of scale when you'll have your own numbers on your sheep, and you'll know what your ground can produce, and you'll know what your ewes can cope with. So think about where your body condition scores may be. What is important is the amount of loss of that body condition. So a drop from of a score or more in quite a short space of time is also very significant, regardless of maybe what that score was. If they're dropping quite quickly at a time when they've got ample grass, or they're not working hard, they're dry, and they're not actually having to produce much milk, if they are losing condition and the ground on their feet's good, then there's a problem. So we need to think about that. Can we explain where they might be thin? Common things are common. We're taught this at vet school, everybody's taught this, and it's very true. So before we start to panic about icebergs, and we don't need to panic, but we do need to be concerned. But before that, take it all the way back to what might be going on in that flock and what causes ewes to be thin. So teeth, losing teeth, definitely. Teeth that are worn, molar abscesses, and misalignment in the molar teeth, they will cause ewes to be thin. Have they got enough nutrition? So not only can they eat what they need, but have they got enough nutrition? Certain times, over the past few years, we know that they haven't had that, and that we've been in periods of drought, or we've been in periods of really, really wet conditions where they've not been able to actually physically get enough dry matter in. So if a ewe hasn't got enough, so she really, to be gaining a condition score over around 6 weeks, She needs good grass over around 6 weeks to gain a body condition score. And so if she hasn't got that, that will go on to explain why we might have thin ewes. Trace element supplies are very important, particularly cobalt and selenium. How the flocks are managed. So looking at whether we can, have we got the lower body condition score ewes in with the fitter ones, that will affect who gets the best grazing of that flock. The fitter ewes will graze better, the leaner, less strong ewes will be given the less palatable feed. And then have we got any parasites? So internal, external parasites. Do we have Haemonchus? Do we have worms? Fluke, scab mites, ticks. All of those are going to be affecting how our ewes are performing. And quite helpfully, we can do, to a degree, things about those. And it's worth eliminating those before, or thinking about them with your vet before we start thinking about the icebergs. And lameness, a massive cause of ewes being thin. And on many flocks, my own included, we can separate the thin ewes and the lame ewes, and they are the same group of sheep. And we could either do it on whether they're lame or whether they're thin. Apart from a few outliers, most of the time they are the same animals. So we can't ignore that lameness. If we've got thin ewes and we've got quite a few lame sheep, we need to address that, as well as thinking about the icebergs. But they're all things that you could work with your vet to help explore and make sure that you've ticked them off before we then start thinking about what else might be going on in the flock. And just to exemplify that fact, the photograph at the top there, those were some of my sheep, and they were the lame ones, but they were actually the lean ones as we separated them out. So it's just it's quite obvious, and it was a nice way of demonstrating that. There you go. I've admitted I've had some lame sheep, and they were dealt with. So how many ewes are a problem? So thin ewes affect our replacement rate, and if they are thin because they've reached a particular age, so they've had a good productive life in the flock, they will fall into that normal replacement rate at which you need to keep the flock productive, which is typically around 18 to 20%. So that has got a cost with it, hasn't it? You've got to buy those replacements in, or you're breeding your own. There is an input for you to spend money to replace those ewes. And so a 600 ewe flock, having to buy in and replace 120 ewes, we're talking quite a lot of variable costs there that need to go into the flock. And that, if that's quite controlled and you're controlling that, that is a good spend of money because you're improving the productivity. But if your replacement rate is increased above that 18 to 20% because you've got issues that are affecting the flock, such as we've just described, like lameness, etc., but also because of iceberg diseases, suddenly the amount of money you're having to input and spend is increasing, and that will really impact on your bottom line. So it is worth spending some money to find out what might be going on to avoid having that big, almost sometimes flocks have a big gap in ages, so they have a very young flock because they've had to cull out quite a lot and replace, and that affects performance and production as they go through the years. So it's really worth thinking about that, and thinking about who's making the decision for them to leave. Is it the sheep or is it you? And we want it to be you. We don't want them to be getting a disease and having to leave either by dying on the farm or not being able to leave because, or leaving because they're too thin and then got a poor cull value, and leaving when they're only a 2 or 3 crop ewe. A percentage, any ewe above your normal target replacement rate really is starting to become a cost. Right, why are they a problem? We know all this, but it's just to bring it all back again to highlight why it's important to look at what the effects may be, because they're all hidden costs happening at different times of year because we've got thin ewes, because they've not gained condition. So pre-tupping, where we are now, or almost going into tupping, we've got reductions in ovulation and conception, and we get our high barren rates if the ewes aren't at the right body condition score. Scanning, we get differences in how the placenta develops and the birth weight of lambs and how the udder is starting to develop. That all leads into lambing, where on top of those issues, we've then got less vigorous lambs, we've got reduced colostrum quality and volume, milk supply, increases in metabolic disease and mastitis, and poor mothering. And then when we actually get to weaning, we've got issues on egg quality at the following tupping time if we've got very lean animals at weaning, if not even earlier than weaning, around 5-6 weeks after lambing. We'll have issues. We've got greater risk of fly strike, and we've got reduced immune function. And the project highlighted this actually, which I'll talk about a bit later. But iceberg diseases will keep our ewes, if they're present in the flock, lean at these specific areas. And if we can't explain why these sheep are lean, we need to maybe investigate a bit more. And why are they a problem for the farmer and the shepherd? And I should put the vet in there as well, because there is a morale issue for everybody when we are having to do extra work on top of an already busy life. So at pre-tupping, we need to, often if we've got leaner ewes, we need extra groups. We might need to feed them extra. We might need extra anthelmintic treatments, which again, we'll talk about later in the project. At scanning, grouping again, when we're giving vaccines, which we tend to give from scanning onwards, we might be looking at foot vax, we might be looking at the Clostridial and Pasteurella vaccines. The ability of the animal to use that vaccine and make a good immune response is affected by how healthy she is. And if she's lean, she won't have as good a immune response because her immune function's impacted. She's likely to have a reduced scanning. And then obviously we've got our older, thinner ewes that are thinner, maybe not from disease, but because they're a bit older, we can get those increases in multiples, which are also a pain. Lambing time, extra feed, labour, having to feed lambs, lower birth weights and so on. And then at weaning, extra grouping again, culling early sometimes because they've got reduced value and they don't rear as much. They've got a reduced rearing value. So percentage, so that they're having impacts all the way through. So they need hopefully to be in your mind and thinking, right, can I explain this these ewes, why aren't they improving, what, getting ahead of the game. Okay, so moving back to iceberg diseases now. So hopefully we've thought about what the common things that cause ewes to be lean, but let's think about what these iceberg diseases are. So they're also called production limiting diseases because they limit production, the clues in the name, and they're infectious. They're endemic in the UK, so we have to live with them. They are, as I said earlier, characterised by a slow onset of disease, which ultimately ends in chronic wasting, and that impacts upon the flock. So as vets and farmers, when we're dealing with them, they can be frustrating. They're difficult. These aren't easy things to deal with, and they can take a while to get our heads around and work out what's going on. And quite often there might be more than one disease involved. But getting a handle of them for the reasons I've just said can really improve flock efficiency. And flocks that have dealt with or are dealing with these diseases have noticed a lift in everything else. So where they may have had lambs not finishing or mastitis or higher levels of mastitis, or where they may have just had issues with daily live weight grain in lambs, once they've highlighted what these icebergs that may be causing an effect and started to improve them and reduce them out of the flock, they see all those other things lift, colostrum quality, lamb vigor, all of that can be impacted. So they're worth looking at. And from an efficiency point of view, carbon is the buzzword, I suppose, and rightly so. And we know that efficient ewes that are performing efficiently are better for the environment, and that's got to be a good story that we want to continue to shout about. So when we're dealing with, we do need, and I've put this in here because I think it's helpful for all of us to know that these diseases themselves are tricky. They're very good at hiding from the immune system at certain times, which makes them difficult to find on certain tests. The tests themselves are imperfect, for want of a better word. So they have different sensitivities and specificities. So it's really up to the vets and the labs to work together to decide on each individual system how we need to investigate them. And then there's the realities of farming and the cost of having them and dealing with these on top of everything else. So these, when we do find icebergs, they're not something usually we can solve in a season or a year. They take a while, but we can deal with them. Right, so what are they? I've put this slide up. There is so much information behind what these diseases are, and it is very overwhelming for anybody, vets as well, to actually listen to them. So I'm not going to do that because, you know, this is a Thursday evening. This is meant to be, well, it is educational. I don't want to depress anybody, but it's more about awareness. The point being that the ewe in the middle there had I found she had 3 of these diseases actually, and the farm itself where she lived, not for much longer after that photo, actually had 4 of these diseases. Actually, at some point in time, they'd had all 5 of them. So that is just to show that looking at them, because they cause leanness, they cause poor body condition, they can all look very similar, but there are a few differences. So what are they? So if I'm going to start at the top, so we have the CLA, which is abscesses, and these abscesses are formed in the lymph nodes. I'm starting with the less impactful one, should I say. So in the UK, we tend to see CLA superficially. Not always. Some farms do have it inside, which we call the visceral form, but in the UK we tend to see this superficially, which is lumps that we typically see just below the ear. You can see it on that picture there, actually, on the far left. That's a healing lesion where the abscess has burst, and then you start to get an onion ring formation where it starts to heal. So that's CLA. The visceral form is more prevalent in the southern hemisphere, to the extent where in their clostridial vaccines, so their equivalent of Heptavac, they've actually got a vaccine called Glanvac, which is a CLA antigen in there to stimulate an immune response along with all the clostridials, because they have a real problem with it. But we tend to just see the superficial form. Border disease virus is one of the other icebergs, production limiting again, because it can impact on body condition, but also it can impact on fertility. And this border disease is very similar to, well, it is the same virus as BVD virus, different strain, affecting cattle. The two can affect both species, and we see, typically we would call it hairy shakers and weaker lambs at lambing time. We don't always see the hairy shakers, but typically weak lambs being born, high barren rates, and they're quite poor, and poor performance, and their presence in a flock impacts everybody else quite often, because the spread of that virus makes younger animals around them have to work to deal with that virus themselves, and it can impact on production. And certainly, and they can grow and become, if we get persistently infected animals, they remain in the flock and cycle the disease around. So again, impacting on fertility. And some of you may have be familiar with that one. Looking on the right-hand side of the screen now, so we've got mydevisner, we've got Johne's disease, and we've got ovine pulmonary adenomatosis. So starting at the top, mydevisner is a virus. It causes, again, wasting, ewes going thin, but it will also cause respiratory disease in the later stages. This has a long incubation period. It will cause respiratory disease, so the Maidi word of mydevisner comes from the Icelandic term for air hunger. So they need to get air. They're trying to, it affects their breathing. The lungs of ewes that are infected with mydevisner are really rubbery and really heavy when you actually do a post-mortem. So they grossly, they can be quite obvious, but it really needs confirming on samples. So that would be a respiratory disease. They will get, can get a chronic mastitis. So again, this is something that we see sometimes when the ewes just haven't seemed to have produced enough milk, and then as we check them later, we get a very, very, very hard bag of almost rubbery type tissue, again, similar to what the lungs go like. It's a feature of the virus. And we can also see neurological signs where they might appear to drag a back leg sometimes. And we see those signs not in every flock, sometimes when there's quite a heavy challenge of infection. But again, main thing you start to see, I would say, is that you start to see that poor body condition. Another respiratory disease that we do see at the same time, sometimes, this you had it, is going down to the bottom of the screen, which is OPA. And this is also a virus, and it's a tumor causing virus. So this affects the lungs by altering the tissue, the lung tissue, and turning it into a non-functioning, from an air breathing point of view, into a producing mucus and a fluid secretion point of view. So the capacity of the lungs to inflate is massively reduced, and also they produce lots and lots of fluid. And this, again, when it's nice and obvious on a farm, clinically, we will see, not nice, but we'll see lots of fluid pouring out of the nose. And sometimes farmers have remarked that ewes have died, and as they've gone to move it, lots and lots of clear fluid have come out of the nose. And that can be quite a sign that the ewe had OPA. And again, this is infectious. And we'll get that poor body condition again. So those MIDI and OPA can look very similar. And then the fifth one that is causing this wasting disease is Johne's disease. And I'm sure many of you will have heard of that. Again, it causes disease in cattle as well as in sheep. Similar strains can affect both species. With this is a wasting disease, so it's not affecting the lungs, it is affecting the intestines, and it affects the ability of the intestines to absorb nutrients. So these sheep actually eat quite well. They're fairly bright until they get quite poorly at the end of the disease process, but they just don't gain weight. And they often present with a jowly bottle jaw like that you've got in the picture on the far right hand side, because they're losing protein. So they get that movement of fluid into the subcutaneous tissues, and they get this bottle jaw. So at the risk of scaring you to death with all those different things, there's a lot of information on there, and that's not even, I was going to say it's the tip of the iceberg, but let's not joke about it. But there's so much more information, and rather than get bogged down in it, as farmers, I think it's important that you need to be thinking more along the lines of, what am I seeing in the flock? Have I got thinner ewes than I should? And then getting some advice from your vet to then delve into these different areas. That's what I want you to do. So I don't want you to learn or I mean, by all means, do research them, but really concentrate on your flock and think, right, could I have some of these signs? And have I got more thin ewes than I should have? That's what's important. And leave all the complicated stuff for us to then go and find out and help you deal with it. Because we need when we're taught these diseases, we know what these diseases are, but they're very complex and the research is changing. And so we're learning things all the time. So we can work together. Certainly we should work together. And that nicely moves on to the next slide, which is investigation of thin ewes. Engage with your sheep vet, tell them your concerns, and think about, in the first instance, we need to know, you need to know, we need to know how many are leaner than they should be. And without, I suppose, writing anything down, unless you've got a really, really good memory, we can't tell. So we need to know what percentage are leaner than they should be in what age group. That's really important that we've got a record of that, because then we can measure whether it's getting worse, whether it's getting better, and then we know at which point of year are we starting to see these lean ewes? And that can give us an indication as to what disease might be going on as well. And also think to yourself, right, can I explain why they are actually lean? So that one's lame, so fine. She's really old, fine. Obviously, she's not worn down in sizes, fine. But then past that, what are the other ones? And if they haven't got any of those obvious usual things, why else might they be lean? And discuss then with, so go to your vet. That's really helpful for us. You can say, right, this year they've been on good grazing, they're not gaining weight, and more than half the flock, or 10%, are aren't where they should be. And then the most important thing is that any that die, we need to use them. Don't waste a dead ewe, post-mortem it. And that is why part of the project that we did came about, but also post-morteming a ewe that died very recently. So I don't mean one that's died over 24 hours ago, that's probably half of it only left if you found it, or if it's starting to decompose. That's not useful, and nobody wants to be opening that. But if you've got a really recent one, or if you're thinking, right, the next one that dies, I need to get this post-mortemed, it will be worth doing that, if not only just to rule out other things and see what's happening there. Guessing will cost money. I'm not saying that we find the definitive answer with every post-mortem. We don't. But we'll start to build a picture of your flock. It's an ongoing thing. And so we've covered a bit about what you might be likely to see in terms of what the clinical signs are. You might actually just see more deaths than you want. I know nobody wants a ewe death, but quite often farmers say more are dying. I've had another, and actually when I've looked at it, we've lost sort of 8 ewes over the past couple of weeks. Well, those kind of things shouldn't happen, and something must be going on. So that's what you might see, if you don't see any of the other signs of it. And then the more subtle signs are that the ewes just aren't gaining conditions over the summer, or you've got to now pre-tupping, you've got a group of younger animals and they're still a bit lean. I mean, you have to consider grass quality, what we've had weather-wise and so on, but also, you know, we've not been in a drought, we have got grass, and I do appreciate that dry matters are affected. But yeah, if we've got issues still at tupping, it's worth thinking about. And I've put this in because I suppose this is more what I tend to see. I think I might have made a few words up there. But the thin ewe, the slow one, needs a lift. The ewe that's got rubbish lambs, the jowly ewe, so the bottle jaw, the barren one, the wormy one, the ram that's melted away, the dead one. This is what we tend to see when icebergs are present, and importantly, we see more than one. So we don't just see one of those. It's not a red herring. We see a cluster, or more than usual, and that's what I sort of tend to say to farmers, and that's what they say to me, and then that's when we start to get a bit concerned. Okay, so the UK situation. Anecdotally, it's increasing, the levels of iceberg diseases, just for the reasons mentioned earlier, that they can be quite difficult to diagnose, and they're quite late to the diagnosis sometimes. There are quite a few studies that have been done. There'll be more work's being done, recent work, little projects are happening, just like the one that I've done, and we're gaining more data all the time. But my divisner, for example, in a study doubled from 1995 to 2010 from 1.4 to 2.8%. However, in certain regions in Leicestershire and Gloucestershire, they looked at, I think it was 55 flocks, and they were randomly sampled, and 15% of those flocks were infected with my divisner, and they were flocks that didn't particularly think they had a problem. So that was quite a high, was unexpected. There's been some studies with terminal sires when they've been looking for CLA. We tend to see CLA, the lumps in rams, more because of how the infection spread from ram to ram when they fight and it gets into wounds, or because if they're trough fed, they're eating from the same trough and spreading that infection, so they're together for most of the time. 18% of those flocks had at least one positive ram on a CLA blood test, which has got its inaccuracies, and interpretation's quite important with that test, but that was a screen of CLA. OPA, so the lung tumours, we've got a range of, there's been a reported prevalence of between 0.9 to 5.6 of flocks in an abattoir, and fallen stock, Cull-U and fallen stock survey have been reported there. And I think all of us would say that these are increasing. I think if we were to repeat these, we would probably see more. And then Jaundice is probably the most prevalent, with around 64% in certain studies of picking up infection across the UK. And border disease, again, is quite variable. In a small project that I did for Farming Connect a couple of years ago, I think I found a prevalence of 12% in that project, but in other areas, such as particularly in Ireland, I think they found quite high levels of flocks infected or affected with border disease. So the honest answer is we don't know, but we know that it's there. These are quite not historic, but there's probably more recent information there, so we're mindful of it as it being a problem. So a bit more about the investigation then. So what's the extent? So that's quite important in your own flock. Do we think it's there? To what extent? Without sort of good figures to look at would be how many ewes are dying, what percentage, what's your replacement rate, what's your performance? And if we don't know that, you probably have got an inkling of the impact of poor production, but it's difficult to track it. So as scary as it might seem at the start, the more you can record and have as a bit of a baseline. So it might be that you just think, right, ewe mortality, what's it been for the past 3 years? It might be a bit of a scary thing to start on. But if you think, blooming heck, that is higher than I actually thought, then that fits into a picture of when you're seeking help to investigate what might be going on in the flock. It's very useful. You might record all of those already, which would be really great, but if not, at least just pick something that you want to track and then go from there. Think about what are the clinical signs, limiting common things, and then examining the group that you're concerned about. So with your vet, speak to them, they'll give you some ideas, looking at colour of their mucous membranes in the eye to see if there's homuncus there, body condition scoring, feeling the teeth, what are their molars doing, feeling under their jaw, have they got any soft swelling there, mastitis, all those things. You can do that yourself as well as, and then report back to your vet, or you can do it together with your vet. Vets like nothing more than getting their hands on animals and being asked to examine and talk about them. Certainly I do, and I'm definitely not alone. So that could be a good starting point of a thin new investigation. And look at how they're breathing and their demeanour. We're quite quick sometimes doing jobs, bolusing, worming, moving sheep, all this sort of thing. Given time, you can really get a lot of information from looking at how those sheep actually look. Ears up, down, are they actually cudding? Are they breathing? Is there a lot of effort to breathe? Are they discharges from the nose? I went to a farm today and it was only after being there, I was blood sampling some sheep, so I suppose I was at head level, but the farmer said that he'd only just noticed that actually there was quite a lot of nasal discharge coming from these sheep that he'd not noticed before, and he'd only moved them the day previous. So it's just things that when you've got them in, take time to have a brew and just watch them, and you can get quite a bit of information from there. Firstly, I suppose when we're investigating them, I'll come on to that in a second, but you need to think, we need to think as vets, we need to work together to think, what do we want to do if we've got these diseases? What can we do? Do we want to eradicate them? Can we eradicate them? Are we going to monitor their impacts, try and reduce it, or try and protect bringing others in? So every flock will have a different aim. If you're a pedigree flock, you might want to try and eradicate or become accredited free. For example, there is a My Divisioner accredited free scheme. That isn't really cost effective or achievable, dare I say it, for a commercial flock, because that may require quite a lot of investment financially. And if, for example, you can't maintain a closed flock, you have to weigh up, should that be our aim, or should we monitor it, or should we try removing animals that we think are clinically affected? Is that more suitable to us? Or if you're a flock that have done some testing and you don't have anything, your aim then needs to be, right, how do I protect us? How do I stop buying in or any of these diseases getting in, because I've done some testing, I don't think I've got anything, the flock seems quite healthy, I don't want to buy somebody else's disease issues. So there's a few different things that you need to think about as well. Not the gold standard, but I suppose the aspiration is that we eradicate these diseases from all flocks, but that isn't the reality. We've got background infection in the wildlife reservoir, and we've just got systems that don't allow us to really eradicate. We've got co-grazing with cattle, so we've got to be realistic about what we can do. And that's fine, that's not a problem. It's, as long as we know that's not a problem, that's the reality. There's funding and support through your vets and through Farming Connect, so explore those areas. I've mentioned a post-mortem, which is really, really important part of this, and then that will be the start of the flock discussions. It's not a one visit thing, this is ongoing discussions, and don't be afraid of that, because it's a good spend of money to invest in somebody to help you work out what might be going on and take it forward. So I've mentioned strategic postmortems, and APHA, I think they may still be doing a 3U postmortem screen that I used on the project. We need to think about the animals that we want to test. So it's a case of testing the likely animals that are likely to give us that information if we're monitoring, and then the thin ones. So that might be the older animals, or it might be the younger ones that aren't gaining condition. We've got blood tests, we've got muck samples, we've got postmortems, and we've got thoracic ultrasound scanning. So we've got a range of diagnostic tests. Like I mentioned before, none of them are perfect, but they can all help us form part of the jigsaw. And there are schemes out there, accreditation schemes, mainly for My Divisioner, that can be quite useful. And some of the laboratories have tried to tailor the costs of testing to help commercial farmers use some of that. One of that is the My Divisioner monitoring free scheme, which is run by one of the labs. So they're the kind of things to chat with your vet about. Typical investigation then, I thought this would be useful. So this is what I did today on one of my farms that contacted me and said the ewes aren't improving, and they're only 3 years old, and they've been on good grazing for 2 months, and they're lean, and they were lean. And so this is what I've done, and it just gives you an idea of what the vet might do on that visit when you're there, and it can then lead on to other investigations. So we can usually we will take some muck samples from a group of thin ewes, 10 to 12, which we might pool later, or the labs might pool for us, but we take 10 or 12 individual samples. We take 12 bloods, so that's not 12 from each sheep, that's 1 from each sheep. So 12 bloods. We might ultrasound if we can do that, or if you're suspicious of OPA. If we've got any dead ones that have died, we might post-mortem them there and then, at least to get some, if it's happened to be that way, to take some samples. But I always actually really try and get the farmers to send the sheep to a laboratory, because they've got a far better knowledge of how to do the post-mortem, how to take the samples. They've got all the skills and facilities there to take a range of samples and continue to investigate further. So that would be the ideal. But yeah, it's quite a straightforward initial investigation with the vet doing maybe clinical signs, as we said before, and some discussion about the history of what's been happening. That can give us some information about what might be going on. And when I talk about the project, you'll see that. What do we do if we find them? Firstly, don't panic. We can manage what we're finding. And don't panic, because the fact that you have done some screening and looking for them is really useful to you. Those people that don't do any testing aren't ever going to find any disease, or not least until it's too late. If you are doing some screening now and you find diseases, it's very likely that those people that aren't testing have got them. They're just not looking for them. And there's a balance, but don't panic if we start to find any of these diseases. It's quite useful to work out how they might have arrived and where they came from, and think about what we can do now to limit spread. So this will depend on what you find in terms of disease. Can you treat them, or can you vaccinate to help? And how can you stop further disease coming in? So there's a few questions that you need to discuss, and it's very farm specific depending upon your system. The worst thing we can do is bury our heads in the sand, because then we will merrily go on until we start to hit real high levels of infection, which will really, really affect your bottom line. So it's don't do that, but do think about what are the expectations of my farm. What am I? Are we pedigree? Do we show? Do we breed replacements? Do I graze common grazing? What can I actually manage? Should I be trying to eradicate, or should I manage the impacts? And all of us have got a different scale to work to here. Like I said earlier, it's quite common to find more than one. But these diseases, which I may not have mentioned enough, is that they really affect the immunity of that ewe. They're chronic diseases, so the immune system is trying to deal with them. And rarely, or if any, the immune system can't eradicate them out of the body. So it's working overtime. So anything else that affects that ewe, worms, lungworm, trace element deficiencies, pneumonias from Pasteurella, they will all be exacerbated if they've got underlying diseases. And the impacts of secondary diseases like pasteurellosis, or if they're being affected by ticks, can be quite big. So it's quite useful to just have that awareness of what might be going on. So I think, moving on from that side, if you appreciate what your flock status is and how you work, and think, can I improve how I am? So we can all improve how we are. What I mean is, are you high risk? Right. So do you buy replacements from markets and multiple flocks? If you do, and many farmers do, and that's your system, that's fine. The expectation is that you will buy in at least one of these diseases, if not all of these diseases. That's the reality. So as long as you are aware of that and accept that, that's where you are. If you want to try and deal with what might be going in the flock, so effectively you may be a flying flock in that case, and you're working on a high input in out system, hoping that nothing major goes wrong. So it can be risky. If you're more medium risk, where you might buy direct off farm or from farms, and you're having discussion with those about diseases, brilliant. Having that awareness from where you're buying your replacement from is really important. And if they say to you, and equally, if you're producing replacements, if people are asking you, what do you know about these diseases? If the person that's buying, or yourselves, and it won't be yourselves because you've listened to this tonight, but if it's the person that's buying, that's selling, says, well, I've never heard of them, I don't know, I've never heard of them, that's a warning sign. But if you're buying off somebody who said, yeah, I am aware of Yoni's, I'm monitoring the flock, I check thin ewes every year with my vet, to me, I am confident that you are doing something to reduce the levels of infection in your flock. And initially, I suppose, as a younger vet, I would say you mustn't buy from anyone who admits to anything. That's not the reality. And I also don't agree with that now. I think there's many farms that are working really hard to monitor and are having a really good impact in reducing levels of disease. And they are much safer to buy from than going to market and getting ewes with 6 different flock numbers. But if you're going to spend some money on your own flock, you don't want to be buying that in. So buying from a like-minded farmer, or even setting up some kind of agreement, will be really helpful for both parties. Lower risk flocks that are breeding your own replacements or buying from accredited flocks. Bearing in mind, really, my divisioner would be the only accredited one, or you're a truly closed flock. That doesn't mean you buy in rams or borrow a ram. If you're truly closed flock, then you are much safer. But you need to focus then on not getting it in. So that's looking at your boundary fencing, whether you actually graze common land. To achieve these medium and lower risks, really grazing common land, you can't be in those groups because it's high risk grazing, common grazing. But that's fine. Accepting that and knowing where you are will help you progress and help your vet work with you, and work out whether it's worth doing certain testing. So just think about where you are. All that leads down to the quarantine protocol, and what to do when you buy in. And there's a different, there's the gold standard, then there's what you might say is the only thing that you can manage to do, but there's different variations. And the most you can do in terms of keeping them separate for as long as possible, ideally until after they've had their first lamb in with you separately, and asking about disease history and so on, and post-mortems, whether they're post-mortem use, can be really, really helpful. So to limit some of spread from some of these diseases in your flock, we might look at how we might manage groups in specific ages, and not breeding replacements from higher risk groups, so groups where you found problems. That might even mean skipping an age group. I've had to do that on my own flock, where we had Ionis that we had in some North Country mule ewes, and we bred our own Suffolk mule replacements off those, and so we nicely bred Ionis into the flock. So we had to stop breeding replacements from that group of ewes because that's where they were coming from. But knowing that, it had quite a good impact, and we managed to quite quickly reduce that challenge, and we didn't, breed that back in again. But we wouldn't know that if we hadn't have tested and investigated. Some systems are quite high risk for the respiratory viruses, which are causing OPA and mydivisner, because they spread via aerosol transmission and fluid droplets, such as indoor lambing. So in certain cases, flocks have actually changed that system altogether, in combination with maybe changing breed and changing system anyway, and that's had a good impact on managing the impacts of disease. So these things can be done. They might look at how they graze, whether they graze in, I know lots of farms will send sheep to tack, dairy tack. If those farms have got Ionis and they've got slurry spread on that ground, there is a risk of Ionis there. There's also a risk of other things like cod, or mainly cod. That's what lots of lambs seem to come back with. But it might be that needs to be changed if that is the high risk bit of the management. I think we can routine screen, like I've said, so we can do something new screens, and we can do that every year just to see what might be there or not. It's good practice, and post-mortem's good practice. And then also, if we've got OPA issues, we might look at screening using ultrasound. Some flocks use the cull policy, which is a very commercial, really good old shepherding style, and it's got a massive value. And they literally are looking at those ewes that are the last through the gateway every time, like I said in that list of animals, and shedding them off and either investigating them, giving them extra time, or culling them. And fairly quickly, if you are really on the ball and thinking, right, these are likely to be iceberg diseases, if you've eliminated other things, that can be quite an effective way of actually reducing the disease in a flock without really lots and lots of testing. And I know flocks that do that buy in and sell, buy and use, sell them with lambs at foot, you know, they're quite high turnover systems, and that's how they would manage iceberg diseases. We can vaccinate. So the two vaccines really that we've got for these iceberg diseases are the Goudet vaccine, which is for Yonis, which is a one-shot lifetime vaccine. It's very useful at reducing the mortality, so reducing deaths from animals that are already infected with Yonis. It's useful for, and it's useful for delaying the onset of those clinical signs and the actual shedding of bacteria. And if it's given to use before they're likely to have been infected, it will protect them against infection. So where Yonis is a problem in flocks, farmers have used that vaccine very helpfully, and it's really helped to save quite a lot of losses and prevent onward infection. So that's good that we've got that vaccine. The other vaccine is Glanvac, as I mentioned earlier, which is a CLA imported vaccine. And it is being imported into the UK, and farmers do use this that have had perceived problems with CLA. So again, that's another vaccine. They're the only two that we can really effectively protect against, but that gives some hope. And I think I covered that really, the risk-based approach, managing the impact on culling, and looking at performance. I mean, and again, just going back to records, if we've got that information, we can really start to dig down and say which ewes are the likely ones, you know, who are the ewes whose lambs aren't achieving good 8-week weights, and it's not neonatal diseases, what's going on. And we can really start to, the more information the better, but you don't have to have all of that. You can be looking at the last through the gate strategy and start there and then build it up as you go forward. Okay, so they are costly, thin ewes, they're worth investigating. You will need some help. Don't try and do it on your own. Nobody wants to do that. You'll need support if you find some of these, and your vets or whoever you're working with should appreciate that and try to help you. They can be managed, and ignoring them will lead to big issues. The vets and the industry are very aware of the importance of these diseases, and it's really pushed to the front, rightly or wrongly, by looking at the impact of carbon and methane emissions, and we're trying to reduce those, and improving and reducing the levels of production limiting iceberg diseases has a significant impact on flock efficiency and output, and then in turn methane emissions and the balance of that. So they're very much at the forefront of the industry and the sheep vet profession's mind. So watch this space. There'll be more information. We're looking at breed resistance work for certain breeds. We're looking at genomics and so on and so on. Different tests, different ways of testing. So the future is hopeful in terms of managing them. We want to make sure that you're aware of what you may be seeing. Okay, so Menna, I might just briefly stop. Is there any questions that have come up as yet before I just finish off by talking about the project and talking with Dan and Maddie?
No questions as yet. They've all been listening. Okay. Listening to Philippa, maybe not have a chance to type in, but as I mentioned, if you were late arriving, please make use of the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Type in your question, and then we can get Philippa to answer them or discuss any points raised. So nothing as of yet, Philippa.
Okay. Right, so what was the project? So currently this is unpublished. I've put that there as a bit of a disclaimer because I've got lots of information to pull together. However, these are the preliminary findings. So this is thin ewe and flock efficiency project that Flock Health and myself and Farming Connect are running together and working with the Farming Connect sheep discussion groups that I'm involved with. And we've had 30 flocks have enrolled into the project. We've got 28 questionnaires that were filled in about the flock age structure. So we looked at numbers of animals in the different age groups and some physical performance information, what the knowledge of diseases were on those farms and what suspicions they may have had, and also got some replacement rate information as well. So I'm going to try and tie that in with the findings, if I can, of the different farms. The farms also had the opportunity to take part in the following. So they could have 3 ewes post-mortemed that were typical of the thin ewes on their farm, where possible. They could also have 12 bloods tested from a group of thin ewes for my division, and they could also have muck sampled analysed, so 2 pooled muck samples from that thin ewe group to look for the presence of yonies, to look for the presence of fluke eggs. So this was fluke eggs, not earlier fluke detection. So there were limitations with that in how we interpret that information. We did a fecal egg count, and if we had high levels of fecal eggs in that muck sample, we then stained the eggs to see how many or what percentage were Haemonchus. So the farmers, so we used 2 post-mortem centres. We used the Wales Veterinary Science Centre in Aberystwyth and colleagues there who have been excellent. And we've also used Carmarthen APHA with colleagues there that have also been excellent and all really bought into this project, which is still ongoing. But I just wanted to show you some of the findings that we've got from that so far. So this is a really big table with loads of things on there, but I didn't really know how else to show it. And when I write this up, obviously it will be hopefully a lot clearer. So along the top, I've got 11 farms that have submitted ewes for post-mortem. So it's 11 so far. I'm sure I will get some more farms submitting ewes, but so far I've had 11. So firstly, let's look at the top. So these are the fecal egg counts, and this is the range. So of these 3 ewes, they were individually egg counted of the 3 ewes that were submitted, and 100 was the lowest, and in this case 1,200 was the highest, and then the other value was somewhere in the middle. So we have got some really high worm egg counts in some of these ewes, especially this one, up to 5,500, 3,500, 8,000, 6,500, 2,500, nearly 4,500, nearly 8,000, really. And this really surprised, I think, everybody. I don't know why I was that surprised, because thin ewes, we know, are likely to be immunosuppressed and are likely to be affected by disease. That said, it still really surprised me how high these egg counts were. So I assumed that Haemonchus would be having a big part in these egg counts, because it's been this year and last year and maybe the year before have been really good years climate-wise for Haemonchus. We've had hot weather, we've had wet weather, we've had hot weather, and we've had lots of cases of Haemonchus. But actually, quite surprisingly, they were very low, really. The highest we had was 27% of these eggs were Haemonchus eggs. The others, sorry, I didn't put that one on there, that should say 2. But the others are really low. And at these levels, 10%, 1%, we wouldn't be expecting Haemonchus to be causing a massive issue in these ewes. Now, you'll probably ask me, well, what percent should you be expecting to see an issue? We don't fully know. That is part of our, as in the wider industry's challenge, is to work out at what point is Haemonchus causing a problem in terms of egg percentage. But we know that it's not 1, 10, 6%, maybe 27, probably starting to get an issue there. And actually in these ewes, we did see Haemonchus worms adult worms in the abomasum sucking blood, starting to cause a problem. So that would fit with what we think, actually. So this information is really useful. All these farms that are green had lungworm infection in the lungs, which typically we don't think causes a problem, but as we've looked at these ewes, it actually probably does when the lungs are compromised for other reasons. So that's interesting. Fluke eggs were detected in 4 out of these 10. Rumen fluke was detected in, it was 4, sorry, that should have had one there as well. 4 out of the 10 postmortems. We've had mycoplasma, which is a bacteria affecting the lungs. We had one with tick. Teeth. Another major finding out of this project was we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Half of these farms of the ewes had poor molar dentition. So that's the teeth at the back. So I've got some good pictures I'll show you in a second. But that has a massive impact on how they can chew the food and how they can actually get the nutrition from the grass. And it will have a real impact on body condition score. And it will also have a real impact then on immunity and how these deal with worms. So that was a surprising finding as well. CLA we found 1 in 1 farm. Ionis we found in 3, and we didn't find any mydivisna, which was very nice. Although I did find it on some blood tests in 1 farm. And OPA, we found it on 2. We got results pending there. We didn't find any border disease either, which was very useful and nice. So down the bottom, hopefully you can see it. I've just put primary diagnoses. A lot of the results are still pending for some of these because the testing can take quite a while. But we've got poor teeth and low selenium, Ionis disease, low selenium. We've got some mastitis. We've got some anaplasmosis, tick issues. We did find OPA, and we found parasitic gastroenteritis, so worm damage. We had chronic abscesses in the lungs. We had Staph aureus in the lungs alongside other chronic abscesses, other chronic bacteria, lung abscesses. So a bit of a theme. Ionis, Haemonchus and fluke was in some of these animals with and this is the 27% Haemonchus there, and that came out. And then in this final one so far, we've got fluke, we've got lungworm, and we've got ORC, so ovine respiratory complex, which encompasses lots of different bacteria and viruses, which I'll talk about in a second. So just a few pictures. These are from Lucy at Carmarthen of some of the ewes. So this, sorry, I should have actually put a disclaimer, a bit of a horrible picture if you don't want to see it. Sorry, hindsight. So this is what they call a wave mouth, and it has got this real wave and step in the teeth here, and those teeth can't grind effectively to chew and break down the grass that they can pick up with these teeth, get in there and start to grind. That ewe will not be able to do that properly. And this ewe in her rumen, when you look in the rumens of these animals, the fibre is long, really long. It should have been broken down into a centimetre, a couple of centimetres. And in these animals, and there were quite a few in these postmortems with this pathology, in the rumen, they've got long fibre. You're talking 3, 4, 5 centimetres. So they're not breaking that down. And the knock-on effect there is that then the rumen bugs have got far less surface area to work on, and the efficiency of that digestion is really affected. So if I've learned anything out of these projects, amongst I've learned lots of things. One is to really focus on what the cheek teeth are doing on your thin ewes, and you probably feel through the cheek. So on the farm I was on today, this really made me double check these sheep. You can feel loose teeth through the jaw sometimes, and you can feel tooth root abscesses, and you can feel gaps as well where some of these teeth have dropped out. And so that's important. That will be a cause of ewes being thin, so it's worth recording that. What we do about it can be a bit more problematic. There is a bit of diet issue, but also breeding genetics as well. But that, again, it explains things. And then another couple of teeth pictures here where they've lost teeth and not very effective teeth. On these pictures, these are from Claire Jones, who's been working with me on this, along with Lucy at APHA. Claire's at Wales Vet Science Centre, and they've both been really helpful to me, and sent some excellent pictures and some excellent reports. And so here we've actually got what I think was confirmed as an OPA lesion here, or suspect with a pus and an abscess in the centre of that lung tissue. Again, here we've got some really fibrosed tissue with some chronic lung abscesses. If you imagine this is the lung, there's not much air exchange going in this section here. And amazingly, these sheep, they walk in quite often, and you know, there's very little normal spongy lung tissue available, and they're actually still walking, they're still surviving, they're definitely not thriving, and it's why they go really lean, because you use all their energy to deal with all of this. But sheep are quite amazing. They definitely do not want to die, because they survive when they look like this, and they survive on hardly any functioning lung tissue. So they don't want to die. They just do when they get to a really, really end stage, but they've really tried not to. This is the lining of the abomasum, and you can see these little grey areas here with the little dots in the middle. That's evidence of worm damage, so they found quite a lot of that in some of these sheep. And then this is a nice picture of Johne's. Johne's disease in the intestine will thicken the lining of the intestine, and it also it's got an orange pigment. So in the final stages, if you were to look at some intestines of a ewe that's got Johne's disease, you can sometimes see it from the outside. You can see the orange pigmentation, but you certainly see that corrugated appearance, and it will feel quite thickened, and that's quite classic for Johne's disease. So that was some of the photos, just from a few. I know the girls have got loads of photos, which hopefully we can put into some more reports and presentations, but these were just to give you a flavour, if that's a good word, of what they found. Right, is Dan there? Mena or Dan? Right, I'm going to introduce now then, before we finish and have some questions. Dan was one of the farmers in the project. And I'll really appreciate him letting me share some of the findings that we found on his farm. And Dan's down on the Gower, for those who don't know him, but I'm sure many of you do. So first, Dan, just very quickly, and this is the only bit I'm going to make you do, apart from maybe any questions. Why were you interested in the project? When I mentioned this project, what were your thoughts?
I just thought it was a good way to check out any problem use. Free.
Yeah, for free.
You know, it's always something I've thought it might help to do, and you know, once every couple of years, maybe. You know, there's always a couple of skinny ewes which I don't like to look at wobbling around the flocks. I thought it was a good idea to get them in and get them looked at.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And did you suspect you had any issues before we did any? You know, had you had any testing before?
Done general blood testing for sort of energy and protein, but nothing in the disease sort of side of things.
Yeah. Okay. And so what did you need to do? What did I make you do?
Basically, I just had to keep a couple of skinny ewes back. And then once I had 3 and I found a bit of time, I could drop them down into Carmarthen. That's pretty much all it was, really. And then once I was in Carmarthen, half hour later, I'd done and I was leaving there. Yeah.
Okay. Brilliant. Great. So, okay. So there's just a bit of history there from Dan's farm that I've taken from the report from Carmarthen, just to give an idea. That there were a few thinner ewes that he wasn't happy with, and as Dan mentioned, he was interested in finding out what might be going on. The ewes were fluked in February this year. You don't routinely worm the ewes They'd been dipped, or they dipped twice for scab and so on. But those ewes in particular had not had any recent treatments, had they?
No, nothing for ages.
No. Okay. So the main findings from Dan's flock were helpfully, we didn't find border disease virus in those 3 ewes. They were negative. We didn't find any evidence of ova and Johne's disease. We found some parasitic damage in the lining of the abomasum and the intestines from internal worms. A couple of those ewes had poor teeth, like similar to what we saw on the photograph. The egg counts of the ewes weren't as high as some of the other farms, but they were moderate, I would probably describe it, or moving into moderate at 550 eggs per gram. But we checked that, and 10% of those eggs were Haemonchus. So that's quite useful to know for Dan that that's there on the farm. Because Dan, did you know that Haemonchus was on the farm before?
I had a theory. We had it about 3 years ago, pretty bad.
Okay.
But I think it was sort of, everyone seems to know about it now. And I don't think many people knew about it 3 or 4 years ago. It's just looking at the symptoms of what they had, looking back, I suspect a few of them had it then, but nothing major since.
Okay, good. Right. Well, that's good. And that's something, you've got that knowledge now, that kind of confirms that it's on the farm, doesn't it? Which is useful. We found fluke eggs. We found rumen fluke eggs. So those ewes, we found fluke eggs. So those ewes had a flukicide treatment in February. Yeah. So what did you use? Can you remember?
Salantal.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so closantel, which is trade name Salantel. Okay, so that would be killing in February. We would expect, that is, the recommended treatment to use. We expect the fluke to be older, so you're killing from 6 weeks of age. So in theory, in February, if you treated those ewes and that had killed all of those fluke, it had been fully effective, then we would assume that the fluke eggs in these ewes now were picked up this year. That's one theory. The other thing that we need to consider is that maybe some survived that treatment and remained in the sheep, and therefore they didn't pick them up this year, but they are a carryover from when you treated them in February. So that's something that we can look at further. In fact, actually, we'll come on to that in a minute, what he did. To check that. And rumen fluke, we found, as you saw, we found that, and I think about half of the flocks actually that we checked. And it's not uncommon to find the two together because of how it favors that wet pasture, that wet environment. So that's not unusual to find. So going forward, the next steps, we would firstly, before I come on to that, what did you do? You did some further testing then, didn't you?
Yeah, I did some blood tests on 6 lambs.
Yeah.
We graze in the same areas that the ewes would have been grazing the previous few years. But all those blood tests came back negative.
So Dan contacted his vet, and his vet came out to do some blood tests on some of this year's lambs that had been grazing the same pasture as the adults, as the ewes, and to look for antibody to fluke, and they were actually negative. So that kind of suggests that the infection maybe isn't happening this year, and that those fluke eggs may have survived that treatment in February. Then we need to start thinking about, is it a resistance issue? Did these ewes get missed for whatever reason? All those things can happen. So before we start getting really scared, we've got to think about that. And we will as we go forward. So I think the next steps with Dan would be a review of worming protocols for some of the thin ewes, bearing in mind the Haemonchus. We've talked about the blood samples, they were negative. And then maybe just some more checking the cheek teeth, because there were some bad teeth in those ewes that would have been affecting body condition score, and a bit more regular monitoring a bit earlier in the year. And Dan, I know, has got his own way of doing fecal egg counts, and so you could probably make, you know, do some more of these just to give a bit more of a heads up. Okay, thank you, Dan. Is that basically where we're at for now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, Maddie, are you there? Move on to Maddie.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Hi, Maddie. Maddie is over near Aberystwyth. Would you like to just, in the Ceredigion sheep discussion group, yes, what were your thoughts when you heard about this project that I was doing?
Well, again, like Dan, I think I thought, well, doing some postmortems for free would be good, because I know it's quite an expensive thing to do.
Yeah.
We have, looking at our kind of KPIs, our replacement rate is a bit higher than we'd like. It's more like 25%, sometimes 28%.
Yeah.
Our barren rates are generally a bit high, maybe around 8%. Mortality rate's always fairly low. A couple of years ago, we did some worm fecal egg counts on the barren ewes, and they came back quite high with worms. And we've also did some tests with Farming Connect for Yonnies a few years ago, and that came back as a kind of a low positive. So I was sort of expecting Yonnies to be there, and I thought, well, that's a good opportunity to see, to look further from those previous results we'd had. Yeah.
Okay, good. And that's perfect. That really, as Dan said, it really fitted into your forward planning of the flock, hasn't it? So, okay. And so what did you need to do?
So just find 3 thin ewes that didn't have anything obvious, so their teeth were okay, or appeared okay to us. They weren't. I think one was about 4 years old maybe, and the other 2 were a bit younger, but they were thin, big runny noses or anything, nothing really to say any reason why they were thin. So those were the ones. We just took them down to the VI centre in Aberystwyth.
Well, main findings for Maddie's farm, they had very good teeth, best teeth of the lot, which was nice. We didn't find any evidence of fluke eggs or any liver damage. They were negative. These 3 ewes were negative for CLA, mydivisner, and Yonnies. So these actual ewes, that was quite interesting. We didn't find Yonnies there, despite you finding it earlier. And that doesn't mean it's not there, but in these 3, we didn't pick it up. We did find significant lung pathology, and I mentioned it a bit earlier, this ovine respiratory complex, and typically that involves lots of different bacteria that are usually in the respiratory system of the sheep anyway, and they become problems depending on, and I think there's a lot we don't know about this, but depending on the immune function and the immune status of the sheep, and any underlying disease, any stress events, anything can almost trigger or kickstart the bacteria that are in that group to start causing lung issues. Mycoplasma is one of those, which is a significant bacteria and a significant problem, respiratory causing problem. Pasteurella is also included in there, which tends to act in a secondary way. And we found mycoplasma in the lung tissue that we tested at post-mortem. And with anything that's got these, we also found what we call T. pyogenes, which is a bacteria that causes big abscesses, not big abscesses, just abscesses. F. necrophorum, again, is a ubiquitous bacteria that's everywhere in the environment, but it will when it invades lung tissue that's already damaged, it starts to cause a problem. We found Staph aureus as well in the lungs. So there was a real mixture of bacteria that had settled in the lungs of these sheep that had caused chronic abscesses and consolidation of the lung tissue. And the mycoplasma, when involved, will becomes a chronic respiratory problem. So anything else, we also found live lungworms in there. They were then probably starting to cause issues themselves because mycoplasma were there as well. And sometimes it's a case of which came first, and I don't think we ever fully know. But we know that all of them compromise that lung tissue and affect its ability to just deal with normal life, normal ventilation, and then it affects ultimately chronic weight loss is what you will see when you've got that going on in the lungs. It's not easy to deal with and it's not straightforward, but it's more common than we think. And quite often we've done postmortems on sheep, again, that I've described, where you think, when you look at the lungs, you think, how did that actually work? And it's because they've dealt with this chronic lung issue, but then they've succumbed to disease from worms or from other issues that affect and impact upon the immune system. So your 3 ewes were amazing, really. One had 6,600 eggs per gram, one had 850, and one had 50, but yet they were all thin. And myself and Maddie were talking earlier about how you interpret that in terms of worming that particular group, and it's a really good question. One that we can't really fully answer other than to say individually sampling a group of thin ewes, which we're not going to do. But I think if we've got a group of thin ewes with some high egg counts, we can justify treating them, and I think we should be, because it's likely that they've got other things going on, that if we can remove those worms, we can at least see if those ewes can turn around, and if they can't, then they can go as a cull, albeit they might be in better condition. 2% of the eggs only 2% were hemoncus. Again, very surprising. That surprised all of us working on this project, how these high egg counts weren't actually kicking out lots of hemoncus. But in general, and I think with you, Maddie, and we talked earlier, this lung issue, we've also seen signs in lambs, growing lambs before, haven't we? Earlier in the season, and with lungworm, and you've done some testing on that as well. So I think, yeah, there's a general theme. So again, a review of worming thin ewes and how we might approach that, what we might use. Again, some increased monitoring to see if we can start to get those egg counts earlier. So maybe we can intervene with treatments to certain groups of ewes before they get lean, before they get to that stage. We could do some more specific sampling for lungworm. Mycoplasma as a pathogen, because it's in the lungs, and things that affect air movement in the lungs to compromise that environment. So when it's humid, when it's warm, when there's not a lot of airflow, will make or add to the impact that mycoplasma can have. And so things like housing can be discussed if we've got major issues with it. There are some limited testing that we can do in the live animal, but I must admit, actually, sampling from a post-mortem point of view tends to yield more accurate results, because we might find mycoplasma on a swab that we pop up the nose, but mycoplasma isn't actually at that stage causing a problem, so it can be quite confusing. And again, looking at management in terms of replacements, so that all comes down to a bit more record keeping, looking at not keeping new lambs from lambs that have had mycoplasma, from ewes that have had mycoplasma, or maybe from certain groups. And then underlying all of that is improving trace element status and nutrition. So making sure that immune function is boosted as much as it can by having the correct amount of trace elements, good nutrition to help use, because mycoplasma and worm egg counts, we know, are a feature of animals being thin and being immunosuppressed. But if we can help somehow by investigating trace elements, making sure we've got nutrition right, we can help to a degree with that. And and further postmortems of any deaths that we get to try and build a flock picture. So, for example, say you lost, and I hope you don't, but say you lost 2 or 3 ewes and we looked at them and mycoplasma was the main feature, then we've got more of an idea of the impact it might be having in the flock. Or we may find something else, which we don't really want to, but it's just giving us more information all the time. But this is, again, it's something, it doesn't stop here. I think we now need to keep working with your vet and looking at, how we might change what we do going forward in terms of worming these, monitoring really, and worming these thin ones. Do you have a fecal egg counting kit, Maddie?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't usually, we haven't wormed the ewes at all year round for several years. Generally maybe do the odd yearlings if we don't lamb everything indoors, but if they happen to be in, and I think about it, but I don't routinely worm them at all. So I think I'll have to start doing some fecks on the ewes pre-lambing, and then maybe at weaning and see what's going on. We did after this, finding those high egg counts, I did condition score all the ewes and pull out a thin group, and then we fecal egg counted them. Oh yeah, with I think I sent the samples to Carmarthen.
Yeah.
With you, and they came back really high, didn't they? 3,000 eggs per gram or something.
Yeah.
Then I did worm that batch, and they have improved since.
Yeah. Okay.
But I wouldn't normally do that at all.
No, I know, and it's a really good point. And if one thing this has really it's really brought to light is that I think we probably need to be looking at flocks and not being so dogmatic about not worming adult ewes, and being a bit more doing exactly what you said, which is some more monitoring and then some more targeted treatments. And I think because not every ewe is going to succumb to this, we know that in a population genetically you've got ewes that will function really well and won't be affected by these, but you've got those that will. And I think alongside trying not to keep them in the system and trying to keep them so they can walk off the farm will all help with the flock efficiency. But it does take a bit more recording, doesn't it, and a bit more data. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Dan. I really appreciate you sharing that information with us, because it's not nice to always, but it's realistic, and I'm really pleased that you were happy to do that.
Well, it was really interesting, actually, and just really surprising. I'd had no idea we'd got hemoncus, and I just didn't expect such high egg counts in the ewes.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Right, this is my final slide. I know I've gone a little bit over. This is just to show you. So some of the farms had postmortems done, but many haven't yet, and they may do if we can, or they might not. But all of the farms in the project were encouraged to send off some samples of 2 groups of 2 muck samples of pooled samples from 5 ewes in each sample to do a muck screening. And so just to show you a few results. So out of the 19 that we've had in Fiona's, 5 of them were positive. So 27% of the farms came back as positive for Fiona's disease. 37% had fluke eggs. And then looking at the fecal egg counts, 42% had egg counts in that sample of between 500 to 1,000 eggs per gram, and 20, so a third of them had egg counts of above 1,000. We had almost half and half positive for hemoncus, and 10 out of 19 negative. And of those, 18 of those that were positive, sorry, that shouldn't say, that should be 9 actually out of 19, were less than 10%, and only one of them, that 27%, was higher than 10% of hemoncus, and 58% of those farms came back for positive rumen fluke. So hopefully I'll get a few more samples in, because the farms have got them, just need to get around to sending them in, and that can add to what we found and build up a picture for this year on what we found. And my hope is that the farmers involved will see this as a benefit and as a way of screening, and maybe repeat this year on year with some blood samples for my division, hopefully, just to look at where they are as a flock and to give confidence in if they're selling replacements or just know their flock status, so they're better informed to make decisions when it comes to thin ewes. Okay, Menna, I will finish there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Phila. We have one question, so I might as well ask it. I know we've gone slightly over time, but I do agree with everybody, I'm sure. It's been very worthwhile. So one question we have had, I wonder if not routinely worming ewes is increasing the incidence and significance of lungworm in flocks.
Yeah, so the question is, it you wonder if because we don't routinely worm ewes, that's increasing the significance of lungworm. Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's one that, and if Fiona's there, we constantly are having this discussion. And so the answer is probably yes. Because we don't routinely worm ewes, we are possibly getting more lungworm. What I don't see is that the lungworm is the primary cause of disease. I only find it usually when there's some other disease going on. I know that doesn't answer the question, but it's just a finding that we probably are getting more lungworm, but what is the impact of it? Is that a problem? Is it causing disease? I don't know. It might be. And if it's causing a lot of lung damage and there's other diseases going on, it's not going to help, definitely. And it does lead to abscesses and it leads to compromised lung tissue. Yes. But I think there may be other things going on as well. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
No, I think I just agree with you there, Philippa.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I think that's the end of the questions. I think a lot of people probably, and listeners, need time to kind of process that information and then kind of work with their vets then to maybe do a forward plan for their flocks or do some recording and kind of looking more carefully and closer really at their kind of thin ewes.